Thank you. Welcome everybody to another episode of the UW Space Dialogues. And I want to begin by thanking Salal Credit Union and for helping us put on this series. And then also want to thank Amy Sprague, who always does so much work for us to make these talks run smoothly. I do have two announcements to make about our upcoming events. I will do those later, and then Amy will put those in the chat as well. But let me turn to our speaker today, Greg Miller. He is Professor of Military and Security Studies at the Air Command and Staff College in Montgomery, Alabama. There he also serves as chair of the Department of Space Power and a director of the Schriever Space Scholars Program. And I met Greg, he organized one of the most important, I think, teaching workshops, the summer workshop on teaching space in July 2021, and he's planning to continue that on a standing basis. Prior to joining ACSC, he was chair of the strategy department at the Joint Advanced Warfighting School in Norfolk, Virginia. In terms of his background, he got his BA in political science and history from the UCLA. He's also got a master's in security policy from the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and his MA and PhD is in political science from the Ohio State University. Now, he has so many publications, but I do want to single out two that I think are extraordinarily useful and important in the field. 2012, he published a book called The Shadow of the Past, Reputation and Military Alliances Before the First World War. I highly recommend this book to you. The book that we're all waiting from Greg for is entitled Sun Tzu in Space, What IR, International Relations, History, and Science Fiction Teach Us About Our Future. So with that, let me welcome Greg. Thank you for doing this with us today. And we look forward to hearing your remarks on orbital debris and the deterrence dilemma. Thank you.
All right, thank you for that, Sadia, and for inviting me. I'm honored to be a part of this, and thank you all for attending. I'm going to try real quickly to share my PowerPoint slides. Are you all seeing that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes. Yeah, I don't know that I'm necessarily going to talk to the slides, but I think as a DoD employee, if I don't use PowerPoint, I could lose my job. So I made PowerPoint slides just to sort of be on the safe side. What I'm really going to talk about is this article that came out last year in Space Policy. I'm sort of going on the assumption that nobody ever reads my work, and so I'll walk through that article a little bit. I don't want to spend the whole time talking, because I'd like to get questions from people and have a conversation about this. A little bit of background on the article itself and the topic. When I first went to graduate school, as I mentioned, I hadn't studied space in a long time. When I first went to graduate school, the two things I was studying were space and terrorism. And this was back in the mid 1990s, and they were just things that were interesting to me. And when I got into my PhD program, my advisor said, don't study either of those because there's no job market in academia for space or terrorism. And so I just kind of did, mainstream international security, alliances, international relations theory. And then 9/11 happened, and my university came to me and said, can you start teaching terrorism classes now? And for the next 20 years, that was the majority of my life. But then coming to ACSC, I was able to get back into thinking about space. They have the Schriever space program here, which I wasn't a part of until just recently. But where I kind of see my niche is bringing a lot of that international relations and terrorism, insurgency, counterinsurgency, those ideas into the space domain. My first piece actually looked at the likelihood of terrorism in space, and I've sort of had a couple pieces now on deterrence and space, and this one in particular. It was born out of a couple different things. One of my first advisors in grad school told me that the conventional wisdom is usually wrong. And I've always kind of remembered that piece of advice when I've been starting a research project. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with it to that extreme, but I do agree that the conventional wisdom is not always as wise as we think it is. And so, I was starting to dive into recent space literature, and it occurred to me how much was being written on orbital debris and how much we needed to do to get rid of it, how much of a problem it was. And then I actually came across one of Sadia's pieces in the conversation about cleanup methods being a possible weapon in space. And that got me thinking about the alternatives. Are there reasons that debris might actually be useful? Are there reasons why we might not want to rush into cleaning up debris? And, I sort of dove into the the deterrence literature and thinking about this. And it occurred to me that debris, if it's such a bad problem, might actually prevent states from making more debris, which, one of the common ways of that happening is through ASATs or kinetic tests. You've also got accidents and sometimes just intentionally leaving stuff up there. But if there's if we all sort of agree that debris is bad and that too much debris can cause, collisions and Kessler syndrome, then maybe some level of debris is useful as a deterrent to these kinds of ASATs or kinetic tests, or just sort of being lazy about how we treat space. And so that was sort of the genesis of the idea. I'll walk through some of my my arguments, and then I'll let you pick them apart. My standard, government employee disclaimer: I'm here as an academic, and these are my own opinions, not those of my institution or the Department of Defense. So again, I sort of started with this idea of the orbital debris being a problem, right? Everyone sort of agrees that that's the case. There's maybe a little bit of disagreement over the extent to which it is a problem and at what point it becomes a crisis. But nobody is sort of talking about orbital debris being this wonderful thing. And I've got a definition here from NASA on what orbital debris is. And, so you've got this conventional wisdom. And what had occurred to me is we were talking about all these or writing about all these different options for dealing with orbital debris. Nobody's asking the question about unintended consequences, right? What if we clean up orbital debris? What if we make space pristine, completely clean of any of this? What effect does that have? What are we not thinking about? And obviously, as I mentioned, the one idea is any proposed solution to cleaning up debris can be weaponized. There have been several different examples of that, right? You've got nets, you've got lasers, you've got spacecraft with arms. We just saw China potentially doing one of these types of experiments. Each of these types of things that might be incredibly effective at cleaning up debris can also clean up lots of other things in space. And so that's a downside or a potential consequence or risk of rushing into debris cleanup. But I again, want to focus on this idea of debris as deterrence. And so I'm making a couple assumptions, that states are rational and self-interested. And by that, what I mean is, in particular, that states are not going to intentionally do things in space that will harm their interests in space. Now, I published this article at the end of last year, and then Russia puts up an ASAT test that puts their astronauts in harm's way on the ISS. And that's one of the dangers of putting an argument out there is we're dealing with leaders who don't always listen to us. But in general, I think the assumption still holds. We don't necessarily know what Putin's interest was in doing that. And I have some other ideas about that I'll keep to myself. But that's one assumption. The other is that all states have, at least spacefaring and space-reliant states, have an interest in keeping space clean to an extent that that there is no threat to their interest. That doesn't necessarily mean completely free of debris, but it means, not to the extent that we're having to move spacecraft out of orbits or adjusting orbits or potentially risking people's lives. And I do assume that there's a danger of too much debris, but I don't think we're at that point yet. And that there is essentially an acceptable amount of debris in each orbit, and it will depend on the orbit, what is an acceptable amount. My sort of caveat here is I'm not anywhere in this presentation or article arguing that debris is a wonderful thing and we should be creating more debris and just ignoring the problem. That's not at all my position. And again, I'm sort of assuming that it's a potential danger. But what I'm trying to look at is what are the unintended consequences of just cleaning it up. I don't necessarily want to get into this slide too much because I don't know to what degree people have studied deterrence and know about deterrence. I'll sort of put this up there and we can talk about them in Q&A if anybody has any questions. But essentially what I'm thinking about in this piece is you've got the standard ideas of deterrence by denial versus deterrence by punishment. You've got newer concepts of deterrence by norms, deterrence by entanglement. And what I'm proposing is another sort of form of deterrence, deterrence by debris. And what sets it apart from the other forms of deterrence is this is not necessarily something intentional that states have done in order to prevent certain actions. It's simply a fact of the strategic environment that there is debris, but if it's a bad thing, it might have a deterrent effect, much the same way that an intentional statement or movement of forces or an alliance or some other action might have a deterrent effect. Whether we put debris there or not, it might have a deterrent effect that can be useful in some ways. Okay, so that I've already beat that to death. The bottom line here is that if we remove debris completely, and this will depend on the technology, right? And any technology is not just going to evaporate debris and suddenly we have a clean, clean orbits. But any removal of debris, if you buy my basic argument, could weaken deterrence and make the types of kinetic tests that we want to deter more likely. Or even worse, make hostile actions in space more likely if you've got a technology that can relatively quickly clean up debris so that that debris doesn't pose a threat. Then the deterrent effect of the consequences of an ASAT, kinetic ASAT or hostile actions essentially is weakened. We lose that deterrence effect of any of those things. And so again, the nature of the effect of any cleanup will depend on the technology. It will also obviously depend on the nature of risk aversion to each leader. Some leaders will say, I don't want to create any debris because there's a potential chance of it coming back to hurt our interests. And so I'm not going to launch no matter what. Others may be less averse to that kind of risk. I think maybe Russia and Putin fall into that category. They see other benefits to ASAT tests that outweigh any possible costs of debris. And so there's a lot of variables here that will affect who is deterred and who is not. There's another part of this that I don't think I have on a slide anywhere. Not all states are reliant on space. Not all states are in space and care about space. And some of them might have the ability to, at some point, create debris, and it doesn't necessarily affect them the same way it does those states that are heavily dependent on space, right? So there's a variation in who cares about this issue more than others, and somebody who's really wanting to create chaos and doesn't worry about GPS collapsing or other types of effects may not care about debris, may not care about reducing debris or be deterred by it. And so that's going to be a factor in this. So jumping ahead in the piece a little bit, I'm looking at a couple of possible solutions. The idea being, let's say we all agree that we need to clean up debris. And we have an ability to do that. Then the question is, how do we still retain some level of deterrence against kinetic ASATs, against hostile actions in space, even if we remove this deterrent, this particular debris deterrent? How do we still have deterrence? And there's a couple of ideas that are sort of addressed in the literature in general about deterrence in space. If we can sort of make our satellites more resilient, more maneuverable, then they're maybe less susceptible to debris. There's a downside to that, right? It requires fuel, it requires energy, and so that raises the cost of the launch. If you're moving a bunch of stuff around, it potentially reduces their lifetime or their mission effectiveness. And it also, if you're able to move spacecraft, that actually weakens deterrence from debris, right? If debris ceases to be less of a threat, then it ceases to be less of a deterrent. And so that's not necessarily the best path if we're trying to deter these types of things. There's a lot of discussion about norms against creating debris. And like with all international norms, there's some problems with this, right? It's difficult to enforce norms. It relies on states doing it. I would argue there's a norm now against kinetic ASATs. And some states adhere to it, but others are less inclined to adhere to it. And unless there's enforcement of that norm, it's going to collapse, or it's not going to be very effective. And so, those norms work for the states that are willing to accept them. It doesn't necessarily work for everybody. And same argument with international institutions. One of the ideas is creating an institution that, we sort of track debris. There's a number of private companies that do that. I know the US government does that. If we had an international institution that maybe worked along the lines of like the World Trade Organization, where you're sharing information, you're creating reports on who's doing good things and who's doing bad things. And if it actually had like a panel where it could enforce agreements not to create more debris, not to do kinetic ASAT tests, things like that, maybe that would be useful, but it's sort of the same problem with norms. It depends on states to enforce it and to create it in the first place. And so these are all possible solutions. They're not particularly satisfying to me because I don't think they necessarily solve the problem of how do we still deter these types of actions, even if we get rid of this debris. And so there's a couple things that I came up with. Again, I'm not sure they're the solutions, but I think they're possibilities. And one that occurred to me along international legal lines is if we could treat debris like naval mines and hold the actors accountable that create debris, even if they don't have hostile intent or that don't have hostile intent against their victims. If there's a way that we can create an accountability regime for simply the creation of debris, that might act as a deterrent, at least make people a little more cautious about what they do in space, both in terms of creating debris, but also these kinds of tests and hostile actions that we want to deter. Another option, and none of my reviewers on the article liked this idea, but I stuck with it. I held firm to it. Is if we could either as a global community or even certain alliances like NATO treat the actions that create debris as acts of war. Obviously accidents happen and debris occurs, but if you're intentionally launching a weapon into space that creates debris, then should that be considered or at least debated as an Article 5 type of threat to NATO interests? I think it's at least worth talking about. We talk about it in terms of cyber. If somebody launches a cyber attack against the NATO ally, does that invoke Article 5? Does that constitute an act of war? I'm not sure that a satellite test that causes threatening debris is really any different. And in some ways may threaten more than just NATO states. And so there might be more support for something like that. And a part of that is you don't have to be a spacefaring state to treat those kinds of acts as an act of war, right? You can engage in cross-domain deterrence. If somebody does something in space and you don't have the ability to retaliate in space, you can retaliate in other ways, whether it's in cyber or conventional forces or economic sanctions or diplomatic sanctions. It doesn't just rely on tit-for-tat types of actions. The other thing, and this is sort of outside the international arena, just sort of things that maybe the United States could be thinking about to enhance deterrence, is if we have more multinational and more dual use spacecraft, that might act as a way to strengthen deterrence, because you've got more actors involved being threatened by debris, and not just government actors, but commercial actors. The more potential threatened parties that are involved, maybe the more likely acts are to be deterred. And also, the more people we have in space, the more lives we put on the line, ironically, might act as a deterrent. And this is that tripwire concept from the deterrence literature. We had enough troops in Germany, not to prevent a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, but to basically be a tripwire to ensure the United States would be involved. And if you have more people in space, not just from one country, but from multiple countries, maybe there's a tripwire effect there that would also deter these types of hostile actions. Again, just sort of not necessarily, definitive solutions, but ideas that I put forth to try to, how do we get rid of debris, which we can all agree is bad? If it's got a deterrent effect, how do we still maintain some level of deterrence while getting rid of that debris? And so that's basically where I am. That's the gist of the article. I see there's some questions in chat. Yeah. So I'm gonna try to stop sharing and open up my chat.
You've given us a lot to think about. Thank you, Greg. I mean, this is really fantastic. And I hope we have also your article maybe put in the chat, Amy, if you could just find it and make sure that it goes out to everybody. Greg, let me just ask you a very general question. And I think this is part of the dilemma that we're dealing with deterrence today, is the issue of attribution. Yes, so I think that, and I think this is part of the talk that you already touched upon this, but it's easier to do that, the kind of model that you're thinking about in the context of kinetic tests. What do we do when we're not able to attribute certain things such as cyber or laser or some such stuff that is actually going into space? How does the model work in that context? You're not creating debris, you still have a problem. So
yeah, I guess if you're talking about deterring those kinds of attacks, non-kinetic ASATs, I'm not sure. I'd have to think about how this applies. I think it still applies. The idea of debris still is relevant, because even if you laze a satellite and make it ineffective, that's still debris, right? You don't have hundreds of pieces, but you have a non-functioning piece of metal moving around in an orbit. And so it's not exactly the same problem, but it is still debris. And so in that respect, non-kinetic hostile actions would still create a similar type of problem. And so I think it's relevant to ask, can we deter those types of actions as well in other ways? I think that, if you buy the argument that having more multinational craft, more crewed craft, if those things can be effective deterrents, then that maybe is still a deterrent even against non-kinetic types of tests and hostile actions. It may not be as strong, but again, you are still talking about debris. Now, the interesting thing are the sort of cyber attacks that may make a satellite ineffective for a short time, right? And then it recovers. You sort of make it blind for a little bit, and then it recovers. Then it's not debris. And that's obviously much harder to deter, because it is harder to attribute to a particular actor. And that problem is actually going to get worse as technology improves, because just like in cyber, I think we're going to get to a point where we're seeing more non-state actors involved in space. And so attribution becomes even more tricky, and then accountability becomes trickier. Just like, we know that a cyber attack might come from Russia, but was it really the Russian government, or was it a 16-year-old Russian in his mom's basement, right? I mean, how do we hold them accountable? I think we're going to see the same thing as technology progresses and makes space easier. And so in some ways, deterrence is just going to get that much harder as more actors get involved, just like it has with cyber.
Yeah, no, I think that those are excellent points. I think your study and what you have said today also makes us think about, general diffuse deterrence and then sort of very specific targeted deterrence. Thank you. So we have a bunch of questions, so let me go to the top. We have a question here from Joseph Guzman, who's asking, does your argument ignore the value of space for economic development? I think you sort of answered this, but if you could just touch upon that idea again.
Yeah, I mean,
the commercial value. Mm-hmm.
That's funny that you start with that, because my next door neighbor in office, Brent Zarnick, that's one of his big focuses in space is economic development of space. Mm-hmm. And I guess when you say, does the argument ignore that, which argument are you referring to, right? Because I'm agreeing that debris is bad, and a big part of the reason to clean up debris is to enhance economic development. We don't want to get to the point where it's so dangerous to even launch into space because of debris that we can't take advantage of it, right? So I'm in full agreement of that. I'm a big advocate of economic development in space. As a capitalist, I think there's a market for cleaning up debris, and as soon as we make it profitable, you're going to see the technology proliferate to do that. So I don't know that I'm necessarily ignoring that, but what I would argue is that you can have economic development and still deter with some minimal amount of debris, right? And the idea is, how do we deter these types of hostile actions so that you can use space commercially, peacefully, economically, and not have to worry about these security issues? And maybe a certain amount of debris helps with that. I mean, it's definitely counterintuitive, right? It's contrarian in some ways, but I don't think it necessarily ignores it, and maybe it enhances it even more.
Certainly something to think about. Yeah, that's an important link between economic development, economic interdependence, and how that's going to affect prospects for deterrence. So I think we're just beginning to think about that very carefully. I have a question here from General Finnan, who's asking, I'm curious about dual-use spacecraft. Are you thinking civ military?
I am, and I'm even thinking wider than that, and as part of the, I guess it's not put very well on the slide. I'm thinking not only multinational, but maybe a government satellite that has commercial or scientific uses from another country, right? So not necessarily all military satellite have to be country to country. I know there's security issues and things like that involved, but I just think the more actors involved, regardless of whether they're military, state, commercial, one country or multiple countries, the more that are involved, the potentially more deterrence you have, because it's more actors that are affected by hostile actions. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I mean, it would have to be, there's easier relationships and there's harder relationships, obviously. And if it's somebody that's specifically targeting the United States, for example, a dual use satellite that is US military and US commercial isn't going to deter that, right? That's still going to be targeted. But if it's US military and Japanese commercial or something along those lines, maybe that's an easier deterrent. I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, certainly something to think about, particularly as you said, Greg, we're dealing with the dual use technology. So they're cutting across all kinds of sectors. Question here, I think this is a little bit more technical. Is there a graph of the cost of removal versus the debris density? My guess is it is not linear with density, but greatly increases with density. So I'm not quite sure what the question is, but maybe the question is there a graph of the cost of removal versus the debris density? I don't know if we...
I don't know of one, and I'm sure somebody could get a doctoral dissertation out of creating what is the optimal amount of debris at each orbit. I don't have that part of my brain that can conceive of that beyond just the conceptual. Obviously where you've got more craft, more debris, or the line of what is dangerous is lower in terms of debris, right? Where you've got fewer spacecraft flying around, where you've got more space, more orbital space, you can afford to have more debris there because it's less of a threat. And I don't know science. I mean, maybe somebody here who's got the technical background of like the Kessler syndrome. What is that point at which you get a contagion effect or toppling, where you've just gone beyond what is even safe to launch or to exist in. I know it's different in every orbit, but that implies that the optimal amount of debris would be different in every orbit too.
Thank you so much, Greg. I have another question from Chuck Dickey. Doesn't your argument assume that collisions with debris would be the fault of the party who put it there rather than the fault of the person who came to space later and failed to avoid hitting, let's say, some avoidable debris? Most of the high mass debris in High Leo was left there as a common practice before the commercial space era. So are you assuming the debris would be the fault of the party who put it there rather than, somebody who is coming out? So it's drawing in a lot of the legal regime. I'm thinking.
Yeah. So that would actually be a better question for one of my other colleagues, Andrea Harrington, who's a space lawyer.
Yeah.
I think if we go back to the naval mines analogy, if you buy that analogy, do you blame the ship for hitting the mine because it didn't know that it was there, and then that ship causes other ships to break up because of of what's left behind? Obviously not. In terms of common sense, if somebody leaves a mine, they're the ones responsible for what happens after. I guess it would also depend on are all the parties acting responsibly, right? Is debris occurring because of a hostile act? That's a little clearer. Does it occur because somebody's careless or isn't aware of the debris or something along those lines? I think there's still some accountability there, but maybe not to the same extent. The point is not to deter states from using space. If anything, my idea of multinational crews and more crewed craft would involve other countries, ideally, because then you have more actors involved. And so I think that I don't know if I'm answering that question very well.
No, that's okay. I think I'm just going to move on to the next one. This is from Adrian Times, who asks, I think this is an important question. Who other than governments would pay for cleaning up debris? And especially while there is little to no enforcement of liability for collisions with debris. As I think Andrea has told you, we're at the beginning of sort of applying some of our space legal regime. So it's a fair question, I think, that ties into the deterrence debate.
It is. I mean, again, I'm a capitalist, so I think if there was profit in it, you would have private companies rushing to do it, and there are some that are investing in a technology in the hopes that there will be profit. Right? I mean, if you have the ability to remove debris, maybe that also means you have the ability to, provide proprietary knowledge to the highest bidder when you bring it back to the Earth. That's maybe the underbelly of this, another downside to this kind of technology. I think that you would almost, if there's not a profit in cleaning it up, I don't know that we could count on the largesse of commercial entities to do it. There might have to be a tax or a fee on launches, or somehow use of space station or something along those lines that could be applied to the cleanup. Sort of like a toll road or something like that. But again, I come back to the capitalism. I think if we could figure out a way to make it profitable, companies are going to rush to do it, and we won't have to rely on states to enforce it or to really do it effectively.
Good. I have a question here from Frank. Frank is asking, Russia's recent ASAT tests demonstrate that states do not need to target an adversary's satellite to generate debris. So the Russians have enough derelict satellites of their own to distort kinetically and create debris for coercive effect. How can we deter states from destroying their own satellites? Good question.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a hard one, especially because the US was the first to do it. And like a lot of technological things, we opened that Pandora's box and now wish we hadn't, or want to kind of put it back in the box. I think and this is maybe a cop-out, the best we can do is try to hold states accountable for those actions, or at minimum convince them to do it in ways that minimize debris or minimize the amount of time that debris is in space or in orbit, right? And that's been the US argument for the things that we've done. It's been such a low orbit that it didn't last for very long, or it was already falling out of orbit and it was just a test. And that's maybe the best we can hope for on that. A hostile actor is going to be hard to deter if they see some benefit in either showing that they have the capability to do this kind of thing, or if they want to show a force, or if they want to try to hide behind the difficulty of accountability and take an action that is hostile without directly being involved. I mean, there's a lot of things that would be really incredibly hard to deter.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, the other thing, Greg, just to follow up on Frank, is that I've always been curious about what is the problem that deterrence is meant to solve in space. And I think it tends to be a little bit more case specific than we would want. And deterrence is something that is happening in the minds of the enemy, as we all know. So it's, who is it that you're trying to deter from doing what? Very, very specific. So I think, again, to go back to this idea of general and diffuse and specific deterrence, I think that's something that we need to begin to parse as IR specialists, especially in the context of space.
And that's one of my criticisms. I mean, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it's obviously relevant. One of my criticisms of US space policy, especially with respect to ASAT, is that we have not really done a good job of voicing what it is we want to prevent and what we will do in response to it. Deterrence requires that commitment to be clear. And I think, the recent Putin case is a good example where we sort of just, don't do that, here's a slap on your wrist. But by not doing something more forcefully, it almost encourages that type of behavior, not just with Russia, but with other states, right? So at some point in the chicken game, you have to not swerve, right? And I'm not suggesting I want us to go to war over an ASAT, but I think we need to do a better job of being forceful about what our commitment is and what we're willing to do in response to these kinds of acts, if we really do want to deter them. If we say we're not willing to go to war over these kinds of acts, then so be it. And I think that's where we are right now. But if we really do want to deter them, I think that commitment needs to be clearer and more public.
I think that's exactly right. I'll come back to the issue of something that you raised in your talk, which is, as you know, the US is more dependent than any other country on space assets. So do you think that the US should take the leadership on this issue? Is it trying to? And you're suggesting, Greg, that we have some ways to go in terms of concretely seeing results. So that's an important thought to leave the audience with. Let me move on to another question from Lena Getuvig. Lena, I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name. She raises a good question about, we're dealing in a high stakes for all nations. So how do you deter warfare involving debris from happening versus looking at a more positive approach, which is to look at climate change and have people sort of take responsibility for the protection of those assets? In other words, I think the question is, we talk about it in the context of war. Maybe we need to shift the narrative and also think about the positive benefits of space, which may, again, to go to your point, Greg, build some momentum for debris, for deterrence, relying on space assets.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point, and we tend to lose sight, and I'm guilty of this too, teaching in DoD. We tend to focus heavily on the security realm, and we lose sight of how important space is for communications and navigation and weather and environmental studies. And if we get to the point where debris is too threatening, then those things become unusable. I guess my only, and so I'm in complete agreement with that. My only devil's advocate counterpoint would be debris is a tangible thing that we can point to as a threat to our interest, right? And even if it's sort of a nebulous threat, everyone sort of can imagine what it would be like if we don't have GPS for a couple of days. But if we don't have a weather satellite or a climate change study in orbit, that's a little bit harder for the average person to grasp how that affects them, right? And so I think there's a value to focusing on the more, I don't necessarily want to say more immediate, but more tangible security issues, because I think it's easier for the average person to grasp. But part of it also is I think going back to one of the other questions, if you don't think this is something the commercial sector will do, and if it relies on the government to do it, then the best way to convince the government is probably by focusing on the security threats. I mean, it's taken a while for our government to admit that climate change is a security issue. And so I would expect the same fight over, orbital debris affecting weather satellites. But if we can show that it affects military interest in space, national security interest, direct national security interest in space, then I think that's an easier sell to have the government do something.
Yeah. And let me see if there are, I think this is more there's a limit to the acceptable risk for human flight in space written into international law. So has debris risk been included in this so that ultimately it could be illegal to launch humans into near Earth space? Not sure. That there are acceptable, so if you were saying that there's an acceptable amount of risk with orbital debris, do we also accept that there are acceptable amounts of risk associated with other kinds of human related activities, such as human space flight? I think this is a general question.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I'm not sure what you mean by debris risk been included in this. I don't see it ever being illegal to launch humans into near Earth space. Something dramatic would have to happen for that to occur in my mind. And given my beliefs in human nature, I think as soon as it became illegal, you'd have even more people trying to do it from their backyard. So I don't know. What would be the context in which it would become illegal? Just that it's become too dangerous?
Yeah, I'm assuming so. Maybe it's, debris might be, pose such a risk that putting people in harm's way might be a problem for.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was a huge risk to sail across the ocean to find the new world. It was, I mean, human life is, and I don't mean to be flippant, right? But everything we do has risk. If you take out an insurance policy, they're factoring risk into how much they charge you for that. I think there will always be humans that are willing to take risk for exploration and adventure. And yes, if we reach a point where, we've got a Kessler syndrome and it's just, everything we launch just adds to the debris because it can't get through. If we ever actually reach that point, then maybe. If you're talking about radiation risk, I'm not up on my studies of biology in space or physiology in space. I know that a lot of NASA folks are working on the effects of human body in orbit and on Mars and other things like that. And I could imagine maybe if we found results that were so damaging that we could say it's not worth it, that would be a possibility. But short of those things, I don't see us at this point stopping outward expansion of some sort.
So Greg, let me return to something that you were saying earlier, and that is the issue of US leadership on this particular issue of orbital debris. Could we get a little bit more of a sense from you of where you think US leadership is? We're talking about norms, we're talking about building responsible behavior, but where is that talk going, do you think, from your perspective at a military institution?
What do you mean? What do you mean by where is it going?
So do you think, so to bring it back to your ideas about alliances, is it having an impact on alliances signing on to US ideas about building responsible behavior in space? Because ultimately you're going to need partners for geographical reasons, if nothing else, to be able to get the data for understanding how we are dealing with the orbital debris, just as a small example. So does US leadership on promoting responsible behavior in space resonate, in your opinion, with US allies going forward? Are they all on board with the, you're right to point out that it's national security issues that may galvanize governments, but are they all perceiving national security issues in space the same way?
I don't know. That's a good question. My suspicion is, and there's probably an article in this. My suspicion is the states that are already adhering to these norms buy into them, and that there are a handful of states, both current spacefaring and probably future spacefaring states, that don't necessarily buy into the norm or don't care about it, right? Just like any norms, you're going to have a handful of states that try to flaunt them and get away with it, because in some cases there are advantages to not adhering to norms. And so in terms of US leadership, I don't know that we're doing enough to try to convince everybody that A, debris is a threat, and that B, we need to stop creating more of it, and that C, it's not just a threat to the United States, but to everybody if you factor in the scientific and commercial sides of space. I mean, this to me is just a question of basic international relations norms, right? And it's not just about space. It's how do you get states to sign on to any norms or any regimes? Everybody benefits, but that free rider can get away with not doing it if it's not enforced. Well, one of the arguments I do make in the paper is, even with Russia and China, if we assume they don't buy into the norm, why aren't we seeing more tests from them, right? The fact that they're doing tests, but it's at fairly long intervals. Most of their tests are not, kinetic in orbit, creating debris. And so if they really don't buy the norm, or if they're not deterred in some way, then we should be seeing more of this kind of behavior. And the fact that we're not seeing more tells me that there is some deterrent effect, whether it's the norms or US leadership or fear of retaliation or whatever it might be. There is a deterrent effect. I'm just not sure what exactly is most successful at deterring them, and then why isn't it doing more to deter those acts that do occur. But you have, a lot of space powers are not conducting kinetic ASAT. And so, there is a deterrent effect. It needs to be stronger with those actors who aren't as easily deterred, who are more accepting of risk, who aren't necessarily as dependent on space. All the factors that I talked about. We need to do a better job of figuring out how to deter those people better.
Yeah, good. I think that makes sense. I have a question here that's a little bit different from Terrence. It has to do more with your person, and maybe we can close on this. Being a college professor, this person, I believe this is Toby Derrick's asking, I'm curious about the nature of your institution and about the nature of a Space Force college. I'm not sure there's a Space Force college, but is it like that four-year schools or military? Tell us a little bit about ACSC maybe, with training.
Yeah, sure. Happy to. I mean, Space Force College, I'll take that one first. So right now, if you are wanting to be an officer in Space Force, you go to the Air Force Academy. And just like if you're a Marine who goes to the Naval Academy and then you join the Marines, it's the same thing. If you want to do Space Force, you go to the Air Force Academy, or you do ROTC at a college and then you join Space Force. There's not a four-year Space Force college. At some point in the future, possibly, but right now there isn't. My program here is a 10-month professional military education course, almost exclusively for O4s, majors, and lieutenant commanders in the Navy. We do have civilians, we do have international officers. We get about 500 students come through each year. And they take courses on leadership and international security. Most of them take air power history courses. My Schriever program students take space power courses instead. And then they all take a joint warfighting course that is essentially required by the joint staff to make a joint qualified officer. And so it's there's a captain's course for every service. There's a major's course for every service that tend to be staff, command and staff colleges. There's a lieutenant colonel's course that tend to be the war colleges. And so, all of these things are kind of separate institutions, but they all are serving the same purpose, which is giving our rising officers an education, not just training to be officers, but broader social science, history, those kinds of things. There is discussion of a Space Force PME institution, so standing up a separate command and staff college and war college for Space Force, but we'll see what happens there.
Greg, can you say a little bit more? I know you've just taken over the directorship of the Schriever Scholars Program. That is also pretty new, as far as I know. Andrea did it first, and then you're doing it now.
Yeah, it's in its fourth year.
Mm-hmm.
It started out just as one seminar here at the Air Command and Staff College, and now we're up to 4 seminars. So about 50 students come through. It's people who are selected to come to ACSC for their staff college experience. And they apply to our program, and they get a little more focus on space in every class. Like I said, they get the space power courses instead of the air power courses. We have a number of space electives that are actually open to every student, but our students tend to flock towards those as well. Mm-hmm. And they write a research paper at the end of the year that it's not quite a thesis, it's a little shorter than that, but it's a research paper, and they have to defend it. And something to do with space, very broadly defined. The idea is we're not just creating Air Force O4 commanders and staff strategists and planners, but we're actually educating people who are going to be sort of space advocates in the Joint Force. So our students will go to Space Command, or they'll go to the Pentagon at Space Force headquarters, but they may also go to a combatant command and be the space liaison for that whole command. And so it's important. We take it seriously. We have a lot of fun with it. I teach a science fiction elective that a lot of my students take. So we don't take ourselves too seriously, but it's good. It's a good program. I like it. I'm biased, but you know.
Well, Greg, thank you. I think I'm going to thank you on behalf of Spark and everybody else for joining us today, giving a lot to think about orbital debris and deterrence. We have put your, I believe Amy put your article in the chat, so I hope that you will all take a look at that great article and the debate it has fostered about deterrence in space. And I just want to alert you, and I think Amy did this already, but we have our next speaker coming up. This will be Joseph Williams from PNNL, and we are looking at Space Plus Nexus. So our next talk is going to be about the space quantum nexus, and we're going to begin to think about what the quantum frontier looks like with respect to space. Finally, we also have initiated a space law, data, and policy program at the law school here, and we will be running a course, a space course, our very first, on orbital debris, and it will be for CLE credit for those of you who are lawyers, but it's also generally open to the public. So thank you very much again all for joining us, and I see that Amy has put things in the chat as well. We look forward to having you again, and Greg, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. And if anybody, I don't know if the article you put up has a paywall. If anybody can't get through that, feel free to reach out to me and I'll send you a copy. Or if you've got any.
I put up the abstract, so there may be extra Googling to do. I apologize.
Yeah, I mean, feel free to reach out, or if you have any questions, I'd be happy to chat.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for being with us today. And thank you all for coming. Great to have you.
Thank you all.